It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you are today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO video live stream, Series 6, Episode 6, goes live now. So since this live stream exploded onto a small screen near you last week, IPO-VID, well, actually through our daily newsletter, Exchange Invest, we've been opining in Patrick Opinion about the CME. As you remember, well, in the words of Harold Ham, he's a very, very large cheese in the Houston world of oil storage. On April the 20th last year, when the Cushing, Oklahoma, West Texas Intermediate contract traded down to negative 38 degrees, dollars even, it was a wake-up call to the oil industry that the storage constraints and landlocked location of the Cushing contract could no longer be ignored. Well, I have to say, as I said at the time, and I've said several times since, I think April the 20th marked the grave being dug for Cushing West Texas Intermediate futures. And yet, 14 months on, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group have done nothing apart from distributing yet more shameless propaganda about what was a sorry moment in derivatives history. I've been noting this for many, many weeks on end. Now, perhaps that's one of the reasons why you're not a subscriber so far, because you don't want to be bored by this sort of stuff. But while the CME was launching micro WTI Cushing futures, Brent has reigned supreme this year as West Texas Intermediate volumes on the futures exchange looked rather weak. Driven by a combined sense of appreciable crisis, it appears there was a sudden coup de foudre across Houston last April as major players Magellan and Enterprise, as evinced by Mr. Harold Ham, realized they might be keen competitors, but with the CME WTI franchise horribly tarnished, their storage could give the impetus to a renaissance of WTI, or it could be irreparably harmed by the minus $38 nonsense. Thus, we have the unprecedented melding of Magellan East Houston Terminal and the Enterprise Crude Houston Echo Terminal presenting themselves as one to create a new futures market. That alone, those two companies give us 60 million barrels of storage. That's not far off the $90 million barrels of storage, which is the entirety of Cushing, Oklahoma. Moreover, when we look around, well, just the greater Houston area, we get to 150 barrels of storage. Plus, actually, if we look around the Gulf Coast area, in that Bay of Texas, we've got 492 million barrels of storage. And what's more, the fascinating news is that our wonder staffer with, well, incredible ocularly functions was looking at the wonders of Google Earth today, and they can identify no less than 14 piers at which the new Midland West Texas Intermediate settled in Houston can go waterborne. Ooh, a la Brent. Ladies and gentlemen, for landlocked Cushing, this looks to me as if it could be game over. We're on to an incredible moment. Is it a whole new variation on the Bund futures play once again? Because ceteris paribus, I think Cushing is cruising towards being crushed. So, ladies and gentlemen, all this and more has been covered in greater detail in Exchange Invest Daily, the unique newsletter of the Bourse Business. Send us an email or hit me up, Patrick L. Young, on whatever social media you're watching this particular stream right now, and we can get you signed up to understand the exchange business with daily doses of pith. Speaking of daily doses of pith, one of the tomes we produced during the course of the last few years was this, the world's most influential people in market structure. And voila, today, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to say we've broken into the top 20. Number 16 in our ratings from 2017 is in the studio today, the Honorable J. Christopher Giancarlo. He's going to be talking about working beyond digital currency into derivatives, financial markets, and regulation. He's been dubbed CryptoDad for his celebrated call on Congress to respect a new generation's interest in cryptocurrency. The Honorable J. Christopher Giancarlo served as the 13th, but I think in many ways we were lucky to have him, chairman of the United States Commodity Futures Trading Commission. He's certainly considered one of the most most influential individuals in financial regulation, as indeed we said in our own tome in 2017. And he's worked on a number of different bodies: the Presidential's Working Group on Financial Markets, the US Financial Stability Oversight Committee, and the Executive Board of IOSCO, which, of course, as we all know, is the big daddy of international securities regulators. These days, Chris is a senior counsel to the international law firm Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. He's also a board director, angel investor, advisor in numerous technology and financial services companies, and as we'll be hearing later, he's a co-founder of the Digital Dollar Project, a not-for-profit initiative to advance exploration of a US central bank digital currency. You can find him at Giancarlo, MKTS, for short for Giancarlo Markets. If you're looking to tweet him after this show, Christopher, good evening, welcome. Where in the world are you today?
Patrick, so good to be with you, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm in Bergen County, New Jersey, just outside of New York City, in the home that I raised my family in. I've been in for the last 30 years, and it's been a lovely port in the storm during the COVID crisis.
Yes, it's been fascinating. A theme throughout this whole series has been the fact that as we were born in COVID, we've had all sorts of interesting backdrops throughout. I must say, I love your wooden panelled fascias today. It's looking very, very elegant and familial there from upstate New York. So explain to me a little bit. I mean, how did you get into this financial business in the first place?
Well, actually, in an interesting way. So I spent the first 16 years of my career practicing law in New York and in London, and mostly in financial services and mostly with a technology angle, bringing actually a lot of UK-based technology firms out of the research parks around Oxford and Cambridge and Durham and elsewhere into US markets to sell goods and services. This was back in the 90s. When the U.S. IPO market was on fire on the NASDAQ and others, and a lot of firms were approaching the U.S. either to raise capital or to bring in their products and services. And I built a successful practice representing British and some continental European companies in approaching the U.S. markets. Through one of those connections, I wound up on Wall Street, helping a group of entrepreneurs build the world's first electronic trading systems for over-the-counter derivatives known as swaps. And we raised private equity and successfully took the company public in 2005. And by 2008, we had built that firm, GFI Group, founded by Mickey Gooch of the UK, into the world's largest electronic trading network for a type of product called a credit default swap. We had probably 80% of the trading market for that product. And when the financial crisis came in 2008, I found myself repeatedly on the phone with the Federal Reserve explaining to them what was happening in the market, because the credit default swap market became the best barometer there was of the financial distress of the world's largest banking and financial institutions. And it struck me then, and it's still an important observation, that at that point in time, the federal government had no better indication of the distress that its large financial institutions were under than to call around shops like mine and ask what was happening on credit spreads of some of the world's most important financial institutions. And I became a supporter of the core reforms that made their way into what became the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. And as the leader of our then Industry Trade Association, I commended President Obama and a Democrat Congress for passage of that legislation. And a few years later, when the Obama administration was looking to fill a seat on the commission, they asked me if I'd like to serve, and I was honored to do so. And I was sworn in 2014. I served 2.5 years during the Obama administration. And then the newly appointed Trump administration asked me if I would actually raise up and serve as chairman of the agency. And I did that for the next 2.5 years. And it was during that time that I fell down the crypto rabbit hole. I had gone to join the administration to make sure that these reforms of the swaps market actually worked. But in fact, I found myself facing head on the emergence of crypto assets, and namely Bitcoin, and an application to launch Bitcoin futures under the oversight of the CFTC. And notwithstanding a fair amount of pressure, both domestically and around the world, to deny the launch of crypto derivatives, Bitcoin futures, the argument was you're just going to legitimize crypto assets. We felt differently. We felt actually a licensed, transparent, regulated market for crypto derivatives would actually de-risk the marketplace. It would allow the market to evolve in a very narrow way, a natural way, and allow both longs and shorts to actually determine the price of Bitcoin. And so that's what we did. Bitcoin futures launched at the end of 2017. And as a result, over the next 3 years, an enormous ecosystem of crypto assets have emerged with market makers and exchanges, both spot and derivatives, and custodians and surveillance firms. A whole ecosystem around this asset class has emerged, and it's based upon a transparent and regulated market here in the United States. And so a lot of people knock the United States as being behind, and in a lot of ways, it certainly has not always been receptive to new innovation. But my counter to that is it's only in the United States where you actually have a regulated and transparent marketplace for crypto derivatives, and it's functioned quite well. So it's been an interesting trip down the crypto rabbit hole, as people say. And since I left the commission in the summer of 2019, as you mentioned in the introduction, I've been involved in this space in a lot of different ways as an advisor, as an angel investor, as a legal advisor through Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. And I've really enjoyed this time and working on such an innovative, exciting sector, really exploring the digital future of money. And we can get into that as we go into the interview this afternoon.
Absolutely fabulous. What a beautiful scene setting altogether. Thank you very much. The Honourable Christopher Giancarlo here. We're talking beyond digital currency into derivatives, financial markets and regulation. And there's been quite a lot of chatter so far. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've got a question for the former chairman of the CFTC, CryptoDad, as he's affectionately known, then please drop it into the chat box right now for Chris Giancarlo. And also, if you get a chance, remember, we've done 36 of these so far. Please give us a little love. A little like would be really appreciated. It helps us get up through those AI algorithms and make this more broadly seen by the public around the world. And also, we've already got some great audience comment. Well, thank you very, very much for all of these excellent remarks. Mark Weekly, very quick out of the gates today, Councillor of the Corporation of London. That's the body that sits over the august city of London. What a great interviewee. He gave a marvellous presentation to a city audience in Guildhall some years back on the principles which should drive international regulatory cooperation. I think this already is a must-watch, and you're saying, as you said just a few minutes ago, this should be a must-watch. Thank you very much as well for your comments, Beata Young. Thank you for your comments, Christopher Messina. Thank you for your comments also to Martin Watkins, who's correctly recalling, of course, the fact that I do believe that Christopher Giancarlo, you were given the freedom of the City of London at that event, actually, in September 2018, somewhere around there, apparently, I'm being told, as someone who's now able to drive their sheep across the London Bridge, which is something that's certainly not so far being tokenized, but it might be something you can get into. So tell me, one question for you, actually, going back into ancient history, I'm quite intrigued. What was the situation when you were looking towards the whole situation of, you were in charge, you were chairman, I think, of, let me see, I'm trying to remember, was it an ISDA committee or ISDA itself? And you were basically working on the basis of promoting what the Obama administration had done, which was pretty controversial at the times in terms of understanding the overall, Dodd-Frank was quite a shock to a lot of people's systems, I think, and yet there you were from the Republican camp actually applauding it, which seems to have been slightly atypical for the behavior of somebody in OTC markets.
The U.S. has a unique approach, certainly compared to the EU, in how financial and any type of regulation goes forward. So in Europe, a lot of the detail work is done with give and take back with the public sector and the private sector, and the legislation slowly works its way forward, and when it emerges, it's kind of fully baked. In the United States, it's actually Congress passes a broad law, as in the case of Dodd-Frank, and then actually hands to agencies like the CFTC and the SEC the process of working out a lot of the details. And that's what happened with Dodd-Frank. I applauded the Title VII, which is the section that has to do with over-the-counter derivatives, when it was passed by Congress in 2010. But we knew that the hard part of getting the details right was still to be done. And 90% of that for over-the-counter swaps was handed to the CFTC under my predecessor, Gary Gensler, who's now chairman of the SEC. And a lot of the implementation was done correctly, in my estimation, by the CFTC. But some of it, I think, failed to hit the mark. One area that failed to hit the mark was that the CFTC took a very exterritorial approach to the application of these new reforms. One of my predecessors at the CFTC referred to it as the Intergalactic Commerce Clause, saying that the CFTC's approach to this was going to have intergalactic dimensions. Certainly, it had an impact in Europe and Asia, where a lot of the large swaps trading marketplaces, like in London, like in Singapore and Japan and elsewhere, really felt that the U.S. had overreached. And I felt the U.S. had overreached. In 2014, just after being sworn in, I gave a speech in Europe where I said the U.S. went too far and we need to pare this back. At first, Europe was furious. The EU was furious with the U.S. for having gone too far. But within a few years, especially in the wake of Brexit, Brussels felt differently. They felt, well, you know what, if the United States is going to go too far, we're going to go too far ourselves. And we're actually going to assert jurisdiction over U.S. clearinghouses. And this is about the time that I stepped into the role as chairman under the Trump administration and realized the whole thing was out of hand. The U.S. had gone too far. Now Europe was going too far. And it was sort of, you know, one wrong was responded to with another wrong. And of course, as you know, two wrongs don't make a right. We were headed in the wrong direction. And so thank you for, thanks Martin Wheatley for mentioning the speech I gave at Guildhall, because I began a global tour beginning in London. Then I went off to Austria, and then I went off to Asia to basically say, we're going to correct this, and it's going to start with us at the CFTC. We're going to pare back our overreach, and then we're going to call on others to pare back their overreach as well. And we successfully did that. We revised our approach to cross-border application of CFTC swaps rules. And then not too much longer, actually after I left the commission, but not too long afterwards, Europe, Brussels has pared back their overreach as well. I think we're now back to the right place we should have begun in the first place. And where we should be in the first place is to recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to swaps regulation because markets are different. The EU's swaps markets are very different than the markets in New York, and they're very different than the markets in Asia. And so there can't be, and there shouldn't be, one form of regulation to oversee them all. Local regulators know best what's in there. Of course, there should be global standards. There shouldn't be a race to the bottom. There should be global standards. But the application of those global standards should be appropriate to the local regulation. What we do need is interoperability amongst those different standards, but the standards themselves should be subject to global minimums and then should be well suited to the local regulation. That's what got Europe so angry at the CFTC's over approach, because it was our model being imposed on Europe. Now today, we're back to a situation where the US has a model, the EU has a model, Asia has a model, and the different jurisdictions there. And yet we have global standards out of IOSCO, as you mentioned, that set a minimum amount in every direction. So I think we've come to the right place. Unfortunately, we had to get there with a few false turns to start with.
Well, I think like everything, like all good rallies, there's a few false turns along the way. Very few people manage to go from start to finish without getting slightly lost at some stage. But it's very interesting. And actually, I see here, perhaps, well, obviously, she's in Poland this evening, but I see my wife, Beata Young, is asking a fascinating question. She's not even anywhere near to me, but she's obviously channeling the dinner party table conversation that she's been getting from me for years. And she's actually interested, how do you view the current situation with Brexit and central counterparty access from London?
Well, it's complicated, right? And I always tried very carefully as chairman of the CFTC to make it clear that as Americans, regulators, we weren't going to take sides in that. Having said that, our friends in Brussels and our friends in London have to know that the majority of liquidity provision on exchanges in London and Europe is provided by American firms. The majority of market making on most of those exchanges are by American firms. The majority of the open interest in European clearinghouses, both on the continent and in London, are provided by American firms. The United States has an interest to make sure that the disentanglement of Brexit was done in a way that's not harmful to the institutions under U.S. supervision. But quite frankly, the role they play in international commerce is so great that any disruption in that could be dangerous to the global economy. It could present the type of systemic risk that Dodd-Frank and global reform was brought into bear. The focus before Brexit was all about systemic risk. And unfortunately, after Brexit, it became something of national interest. So the United States had to play the adult in the room to a lot of those conversations. And there were some very, direct conversations behind closed doors during my term as chairman to officials on both sides of the English Channel about the way they had to respond to, or how they had to channel their own industrial policy about where clearinghouses would sit or conduct business, with a sensitivity to the fact that without U.S. engagement on those exchanges, there would be no open interest and there would be no liquidity, or it certainly would not be to the extent that there was. And so we had a lot to say on the matter about parties behaving themselves and doing things in a responsible manner that was as focused as it was on systemic risk as it was in service to their own national interests.
Fabulous answer. And I think certainly the question of measured response towards the American influence, which really makes European markets happen in so many ways, is a very, very important one that we can all lose sight of very, very quickly. And the fact that we are so globally interconnected, I think, is quite key. Gosh, we've got a series of questions jumping in here. So I'm going to start with Alex Wilkinson. That's a bit of a monster question. It's going to almost blot us out. Extraterritorial oversight and prosecution by the US has been demonstrated again today with the prosecution of 2 London traders trading on US exchanges within the context of non-dollar related trading on distributed ledgers. Will this disintermediate not only US regulators, but the domestic regulators, with the global minimums disintegrating into unenforceability? Ooh, big question in every sense.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And let me take that on. Let's put DeFi aside for just a minute, because it is an important one, but I want to sort of take the pre-DeFi world as it is. It's a challenging world that's, as Patrick just said, increasingly interconnected to discern where one regulator's enforcement jurisdiction begins and ends. And there is rightful criticism for the degree of extraterritoriality by U.S. enforcement, but at the same time, some of it serves well. It was not as if UK authorities were hot on the trail of the manipulation of LIBOR until the US, in the form of the CFTC, stepped in and took a very aggressive response. But that triggered then, I think, a great deal more responsiveness at the local level. And it's certainly the manipulation of LIBOR is a scandal that should annoy anybody who takes a responsible approach to markets. Now, let's talk about DeFi. DeFi is definitely going to challenge what's already a complicated a marketplace of regulators and their enforcement authority. And yet, as someone who really, really in my heart believes in markets, I also believe that you can't have markets without a good degree of enforcement. Because at the end of the day, it's the people that are doing the right thing. It's the good people in markets that need strong enforcement, because they need to know they've got support in doing the right thing, and that the bad guys and the bad gals will be taken out of the market and will be punished for misbehavior. So enforcement is important. Getting the balance right between who's got the responsibility in a global setting, whether it's the local ones or the overseas ones, and sometimes it takes a prod from overseas ones to make things happen. DeFi is definitely going to be a challenge to that, and yet we need to find a way to encourage DeFi, which is going to lower costs. It's going to make for a more efficient system. It's going to bring enormous benefits, but it's also going to present an enormous amount of challenges, and one is going to be in the area of enforcement. But we've just got to get it right, and we've got to work through it carefully, and get it right. I don't want the challenge of enforcement to be a reason to shut down this innovation, just as I don't want the form of old models of regulation over the substance of the efficiencies that this technology can bring to also be another reason to impede it. But we have to get an effective enforcement approach built into this new innovation in order so that the good people who wish to engage in market activity for making the world a better place, as I believe markets do, so that they can continue to do their work free of fear that bad people are going to take advantage of it. So I hope that answers your question, Alex. It's a challenge, but it can't be a challenge sufficient enough to stop innovation.
It's an epic question, and I think a magnificent answer altogether. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex Wilkinson, for that great question. Thank you, Christopher Giancarlo. I'm going to let you take a moment in order to manage to catch your breath and get a quick glass of water while we're going through, because it's a hot day. But ladies and gentlemen, please do send us any other questions you might have on social media. Don't forget, if you're enjoying the discussion, the cut and thrust about derivatives and the world of exchanges, on a Monday through Friday basis with a Saturday edition, you can always subscribe to Exchange Invest, which is the daily newsletter of the Bourse and Business, which is published by myself with my own daily pith. That's Patrick L. Young. Meanwhile, don't forget to give us a like wherever you possibly can. And thank you very much, Alex Wilkinson, for, after the longest question I think we've ever had in the history of this show, in 36 episodes, excellent as it was, we get one of the shortest responses. Fair answer. And I have to say, I completely agree with you. However, you've gone on with a supplementary, which I'm going to aim at Chris right now. So as we're talking about beyond digital currency into derivatives and related markets and regulation, Alex Wilkinson is asking you, Chris, systemic risk. How does the Fed view the growth of stable coins, and at what point or scale do they get banned by the US? Oh, now there's a question for the father of the digital dollar.
Well, I certainly hope banning isn't in the future. But let me actually, Alex, you were asking some great questions. Let me actually give you a pretty fulsome answer, if you don't mind. And that is, I think there's at least 7 drivers that I see behind the fact that over 90% of the world's central banks are now looking into central bank digital currencies. I don't think there's any one reason for any of them, and nor do I think stablecoins is a comprehensive reason for them, although I do think that's one of the 7. But I'll tell you what I think is driving the interest in central bank digital currency. The first and the foremost was data. If data is our new digital oil, the concern that private actors like WeChat Pay or AliChat Pay were going to dominate commercial ownership of commercial data of the 1.4 million Chinese citizens. Certainly the PBOC said, no, that's not going to happen in a communist regime where the party is the vanguard of society. We're not going to allow commercial actors to own the data of our citizens. We're going to have that data. But it's not just a communist system like China. The same reaction happened in the West when Facebook announced their Project Libra. Western governments suddenly start saying, well, wait a minute, who's going to have access to all that data? And as you recall, Facebook had just been through a bit of a scandal about how they were mining social media users' data. And the concern was who's going to own that data. And certainly in Europe, with its GDPR protection, that was a major concern, but it was a major concern here in the United States. So data was number 1. Number 2 was wholesale market infrastructure enhancement. Singapore, which has been at this now for several years with its Project Ubin, Canada with its Project Jasper, the Bank of England and others, have been looking at central bank digital currency for what it means for wholesale market improvement. And certainly economies like Singapore, like the UK, that service a lot of local, regional area, global area in the case of London, think often about how to modernize their wholesale market infrastructure. Thirdly, was financial inclusion. If you look at what the Bahamas are doing with their sand dollar, they've got a societal situation of tens of thousands of citizens living on out islands with mobile phone service, but without banking access. And so picking on work that's been done in Africa, the issue of financial inclusion has been a driver for a number of central banks. Fourth is benefits distribution and monetary policy precision. Certainly, we in the United States during our COVID crisis, when our central bank was sending out paper checks, suddenly discovered that a lot of Americans without bank accounts didn't find those paper checks very helpful in the middle of a crisis. And yet, with right type of ID, the ability to deliver digital money, helicopter money directly to mobile devices would have been a far superior policy response to the COVID crisis. The fifth factor that I see is geopolitical concerns. China's primary emphasis, as I said, was the domestic use of their new CNY, digital currency. But increasingly, there's concern and there's a seeming appetite for China to be a leader in developing this technology and to export it, to combine it with its Belt and Road Initiative, to distribute it to client states around the world. And certainly national security agencies in the West are concerned about how that will be able to enable the bypassing of the sanctions authority that's been a big part of geopolitics for the last several generations. The sixth reason I would say for this is the development of stablecoins. Stablecoins are performing an enormous amount of activity on a 24/7 basis in foreign exchange markets and other markets, but also adding an enormous amount of velocity of money, increasing the velocity of money, which is a tremendous economic efficiency. Which brings me to item number 7, and this is one that I've talked about a lot as perhaps the most important one, and that is I see a future that's with a digital currency that's going to transition from one where we think about currency zones, the dollar zone in North and South America, the euro zone in continental Europe, the growing yuan zone in China, are going to transition from currency zones to currency blockchain distributed ledger zones. China will use its digital currency to integrate not just payments, but also financial markets, clearing and settlement systems, a whole infrastructure of money transactions, financial transactions, will be put on a single blockchain dominated by that currency. And I can see a future where you'll have a digital UN blockchain zone, a digital euro blockchain zone, and a digital dollar blockchain zone. What's going to be critical is how do those different blockchain zones interoperate with each other? What standards are going to govern that interoperability? China has already set up a blockchain service network think tank to think through the interoperability issues. It's the only country that has anything like it, although the BIS is catching up. We have nothing like it here in the United States. Who's going to dominate the interoperability is going to have a key impact on the global market. I believe that currencies carry with them social values. The social value of the dollar as the world's premier reserve currency over the last several generations have brought with it values of free market economics, of the rule of law, and of economic privacy balanced against law enforcement needs. And people may be critics on that all the way around, whether the balance is right, but yet for legal transactions, a reasonable expectation of privacy. China is bringing very different values to the development of a digital yuan. It will be used as a means of state surveillance. It will be used as a means of scoring a social credit system in which its citizens will be scored on their allegiance to the party and to other areas. And their money may be turned on or off depending on the degree of their social credit score. Those are very different values of those values I mentioned earlier that the dollar has carried with it and the euro carries with it. So these values are going to be critically important in who's going to set these global standards. just as the early internet had global standards, this new wave of the internet, this internet of value, these global zones of distributed ledgers for money are going to carry with it values, and the interoperability is going to be critically important. And if I think there's a reason, and certainly when I've been advocating for the Federal Reserve to get up the learning curve, it's because I believe that proponents of liberal values, of the rule of law, and of economic privacy must have a lead seat at the table as these global standards are being set. So we make sure that the values that got the dollar and the euro to their enviable positions as global reserve currencies are the values that will get the digital dollar and the e-euro to the leadership of reserve currencies in a digital future.
Wow.
Sorry for the long answer.
No, that was absolutely fantastic. That was a superb answer. Thank you very much for the second question, Alex Wilkinson. Thank you very much for the great answer, Chris. In fact, I think you even answered two questions on the way through, because Rombeat was asking, saying, great opening, Christopher, where's the sat-nav of digital currency going to take jurisdictions? Will we see a proper road system anytime soon? And actually, you've told us about the interoperability, and I thought it was very interesting you were talking about the sand dollar in the Bahamas. I think that's a thrilling project, because as you say, in what may not seem like a huge landmass compared to the neighbors next door, the ones that Columbus found second after he crossed the Atlantic allegedly, the interesting point about it is that clearly, you know, there are so many unbanked people, and that's something which digital currency can do for us, which is superb. The questions are coming up fast and thick, so let me get out of the way and simply intermediate. Jeff Cutler. Hey, Jeff, great article about, well, the zoology of markets the other day. Thoroughly enjoyed that in the GARP magazine. Chris, you recently testified in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the Digital Dollar Project. What was your takeaway as to how your ideas are being received or appreciated in the political arena?
Yeah, well, the good news from our perspective at the Digital Dollar Project is that the urgency for the U.S. to accelerate exploration of a digital dollar are being picked up and are being received loud and clear. And I think it actually may be the one area in today's very polarized Washington where both folks on the left and folks on the right may actually be able to get behind a real initiative for the U.S. to accelerate its work in this area. I have to admit, I was taken back by the vehemence of the attack on cryptocurrencies, on Bitcoin, that I heard at that hearing that was meant to be about CBDC. But a number of the politicians took advantage of it to rail against cryptocurrency. And it wasn't my purpose in being there to take them on that. And so I deliberately did not. But I will tell you that it seemed that some of the criticism was missing the point, because we wouldn't even be having these conversations about central bank digital currency if not for Bitcoin. We wouldn't even be having these conversations about central bank digital currency if not for stable coins. There's so much for the official sector to learn from the success of Bitcoin, from the success of stable coins. The official sector will get nowhere if it doesn't take advantage of what's already been discovered. Society for the last 10 years has been actively engaged in this experiment, and the official sector has just been, tut-tutting it for the last 8 years. And suddenly now the official sector is trying to get up to speed, and it needs to learn from what's being done and not throw shade on it, as was done at that hearing.
I think that's a great point. And actually, in order to give you a chance to pause for breath, I'm going to mention two items, which is Capital Market Revolution, the book of 1999, which actually talks about digital currencies. It does not mention the blockchain, and I'm not claiming to be Satoshi Nakamoto, once again, ladies and gentlemen, just in case you think I am. But, that was at a point in time when nobody thought financial markets could manage to have technology remotely in the way, shape, or form that they have today. And I think another thread which actually joins me together with that, Chris, is that thinking about what you're talking about with what GFI did and you enabled along with Mickey Gooch was look at how technological that business was. And yet I think one of the things that was very interesting was that at the time of the crash in 2008, an awful lot of people in Washington, D.C., I think, were convinced of the idea that effectively, this was something that had lots of men wearing braces or suspenders, as you call them in the USA, with, shady, unexposed light bulbs in very narrow rooms shouting at each other, whereas actually the technology was quite extreme. And actually then you have to get on to Victory or Death, because I want to get my book plugs out of the way, because we're going to plug Chris's book for the rest of the show, which obviously, again, has its little preface by Jeffrey Sprecher. But, you look at that, and we've been talking about, the Copernican revolution in finance for getting on for a decade now in terms of what Bitcoin can do for money. And yet it was interesting to see in Washington, D.C., how remarkable that interaction was of certain parties who shall remain nameless. Now, on to your question, can Akaya? Greetings, welcome to IPO-VID. I do believe you're only the first or second person to ask us a question from Turkey. It is a joy to have you here. Thank you for being on the show, Chris. How will the US regulate crypto asset service providers to decrease the risk of insolvencies, which may lead to loss of investor confidence in the markets? The EU has proposed the MiCA regulation. Will the US follow a similar route, do you think?
So there's, in my experience, the US and the EU come at regulation from different ways. And I think they both have their strengths, and I think they both have their weaknesses. The European approach is very often to get in front of a new innovation and write a regulation. And while they're writing the regulation, they kind of say to the market, hold off, we got a regulation coming. And then once the regulation is out, they say, okay, it's done. Now innovate to this regulation. The problem with that is then a lot of the innovation solves regulatory issues. It doesn't solve market and commercial issues. The US approach is much more the innovation takes place for actually a fairly long extended period of time. And then usually there occurs some crack up in the market, some dislocation, some scandal, and then regulation is written. But by that time, the ecosystem is set. And so the regulation, if it's done right, addresses the worst problems, but doesn't undermine the effect of the thrust of the innovation, which was to solve commercial problems, not to solve regulatory problems. Now, it may be my own inherent bias as a US regulator and someone who's operated in mostly in New York and London, but because I think London is something similar, more similar to the US, probably perhaps in between Brussels and the US. I like the latter better. And the reason I like the latter better, but it's not perfect, it's not without its problems, but because I think that ultimately innovation is best if it solves commercial issues as opposed to regulators' issues. And I think the proof is somewhat in the pudding, and that most of the innovations that we've known, certainly around the internet over the last, and certainly in financial markets, over the last 30 years have come out of US or UK markets, have not come out of European markets, which quite frankly has over the last 30 years had seen a slow diminishment. Now in the wake of Brexit, it'll be interesting to see whether financial innovation takes place on the continent again. And I don't mean to be critical of the EU. It's a very important market, and it serves the global economy in so many very important ways. But when it comes to innovation, most of the major financial asset classes that are traded today grew up out of Chicago, New York, or London. And I think that's because regulators haven't been too quick to regulate. They've been willing to tolerate a lot more what may look scary to regulators, but is actually healthy, creative destruction when these innovations come out, which is why I said earlier, I hope regulators don't stomp on DeFi too soon. I certainly don't want them stomping on crypto asset development, because that is where the energy is. That's where the new efficiencies of tomorrow are going to come from. I mean, at heart, DeFi is an amazing democratizing innovation, and I think intermediaries play important roles in markets, but the democratization and the globalization that DeFi can provide is really amazing. And so I guess my answer in short is that I prefer regulators to be a little slower on the draw because that's the best way for innovation to evolve in a way that solves commercial needs as opposed to regulatory needs. Patrick, I can't hear you.
The ice cream van was in the background, which always appears at this sort of time in the evening. So I muted myself. I'm terribly sorry. We are in a position where, in fact, you're hearing an echo of praise from a fellow legal practitioner, Robert Finney. Good to see you, legal advisor to the Astana International Financial Centre and Exchange, and also, of course, a one-time partner of a leading London law firm. You're absolutely right, Chris. And he continues, too often the EU stifles innovation, that precautionary principle thing. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, just in case you've forgotten, we are on the cusp of the 5th anniversary of the Brexit referendum of 2016, which comes tomorrow. Happy Brexit Day, everybody, in advance of tomorrow, whether you're celebrating or not. And even if you are on the Remain side, remember, the prodigal son repo is at work. You can join the future of the UK by embracing Brexit and getting to love it, even if you think the European Union is a great thing. So Robert Finney carries on with a great remark. In the UK, principles-based regulation, though, are no longer being flavour of the month, has helped with this. Interesting point, actually, by Robert Finney there, Chris.
It is. So as a fellow principles-based regulator, because the CFTC, unlike the SEC, the CFTC is also a principles-based regulator. And I think that is, that is the right way to respond to innovation. Because in the case of the CFTC, our statute was written in 1936, before any of these innovations were at all contemplated. And if the CFTC was still insisting on regulating as it did in 1936, it would kill this innovation forever. And so fortunately, the CFTC has a principles-based approach. We look at that statute from 1936 and say, okay, what was it trying to achieve? How do we do that using new models, new forms, new technologies? I think that's the right way to go. It puts substance over form. And for regulators that are very rules-based, it's got to be really challenging responding to the innovation. And so then if you're rules-based, then you have to do what Europe does, which is rewrite the rules all along. So take soft dollaring as a way of paying for research. The EU decided that was a bad thing and ended that practice. And as a result, there's no research being done on SME companies, which are the backbone of the European economy in a lot of ways. And so that rule is going to have to be rewritten. It's better, I think, if one lays down, if the law lays down principles and allows the regulators to operate on a principles basis and look at the nature of their own markets for what the application of that rule should be. Because as I mentioned before, all markets are not equal. Asian markets are different than Western markets. European continental markets are different than London. London is different than New York. Regulators need to understand those nuances and adopt principles with global standards of core elements. Securities should be written with adequate disclosure. Securities offerings should be registered with a regulator. Those are core principles underlying retail securities offerings. But within that, there can be a lot of local adaptation and principles-based regulation. I think that's one of the reasons why the UK has done so well. And I actually am a big believer that the UK is going to do very well in the future, because it is going to be able to look at London and not have to adopt a one-size-fits-all, but a regulatory regime that's really based for its own marketplace, as opposed for 27 different jurisdictions, different countries.
Well, that's fabulous news. A vote of confidence in Brexit as well, which we're delighted to hear from, of course, a freeman of the City of London, such as yourself, even if you are an Italian American and a full-on American of Italian extraction, obviously. So we've got a great series of questions. Thank you,
Patrick, some of my Italian ancestors emigrated to the UK, so I've actually got cousins and aunts and uncles in the UK, so it's home for me as well.
Home for you as well. Well, that's excellent to hear that you bifurcated on both sides. I have some vague Italian relatives somewhere backwards in my ancestry, apparently. Leanne Georgiades, thank you very much. Some insightful thoughts. Thank you. Let's move to another question quickly, because they've been coming in thick and fast. Robert Brown, good evening, Robert. Lovely to see you once again. Should interoperability begin with clearingandsettlement.com? Hint is in the question there. I think that could be a certain declaration of interest from the owner of, well, clearingandsettlement.com, clearingandsettlement.com, clearing.settlement.eu, .asia, .cn, .africa, .forex, .gold, .tax, and others.
Well, Robert, here's what I would say to that. You've asked kind of a specific question, and you'll forgive me, I hope, for actually being very general. We've just finished, in many ways, a 30 or 40-year period of increasing globalization of world markets, and probably never before in human history has there been such a period of global commerce and global finance on a global basis. In some ways, I think for a number of reasons, perhaps something coming out of the Great Recession, but also populist political movements in a lot of developed economies, including our own in the United States, I think that the great period of globalization may be in its waning phase, and we may be going into a different phase of national interests. In that type of perhaps reversal, I think that interoperability becomes even more important. And it's why I was such a champion of it at the CFTC. We were very much in favor of local regulation, but with a keen interest in making sure there were pathways for interoperability. And I talked before about why I reversed the CFTC's global application of its regulations in order to see other countries reverse their global application, but then to focus on how does a US-style regulatory regime interoperate with an EU-style regulatory regime, and interoperate with a Singaporean or a Japanese-style regulatory regime. In a world perhaps where there's less one-size-fits-all for the whole globe and more national focus, interoperability becomes the key element so that we can maintain that global trade and global financial services that were so powerful to raising living standards around the globe. I think more people rose out of poverty into the middle class over the last 30 years of globalization than ever before in human history. And that's certainly not something we want to see reversed, as some economies in the world focus more on a domestic politics perhaps than cross-border. So I hope, forgive me for that long general answer to a very specific question, but it's actually something I've been thinking a lot about. As Patrick mentioned, I've just finished the manuscript on my book, CryptoDad and the Fight for the Future of Money, and delivered it to my publisher. And I talk a lot about how there is a change going on in globalization. It's so important that we make sure that we maintain interoperability. And one area is some of these new innovations, because cryptocurrency knows no boundaries, DeFi knows no boundaries, and it may bring a new possibility for global finance and trade on the back of these innovations.
Excellent. Fantastic answer altogether. I'm going to go straight on because we've only got 7 minutes to go. Jeff Cutler, back again from GARP. And actually, he preempted me here with a question I wanted to ask you. Speaking of innovation, Chris, how do you view the work of one of your legacies, Lab CFTC, and how it stacks up alongside peers at other agencies?
Yeah, I'm very proud of the work of Lab CFTC. It was the first amongst U.S. regulatory agencies of its kind, and its purpose was twofold. Its purpose was to open the doors of the agency to innovators. It was almost as if there was the front door for our big exchanges and companies and businesses that had long been overseen by the agency, and they hired the right lawyers and they knew how to come in, they knew who to talk to, but there was no door that said, innovators enter here and you will be received by people that speak your language and understand what you're doing. And so it was to open ourselves up to innovators. And over the course of my term, Lab CFTC did almost 300 separate meetings with different innovative activities, from big enterprises to small startups. And importantly, they didn't just do them in Washington. They did them in Brooklyn. They did them in Lower Manhattan. They did it in Chicago, Silicon Valley, the Boston research area, Austin, Texas, London, and Singapore. The goal was to get out of Washington and go where innovators innovate and meet with them there and learn from them. But the other side, I said it was twofold. It was also to educate ourselves at the agency. It was to educate policymakers on Capitol Hill. It was to educate other regulators about how this innovation was affecting markets. It was to speak to these different constituencies and explain about the challenges, but also the opportunities of these new innovations. And I think Lab CFTC has done that wonderfully well. I think it's proven itself to be a bipartisan, nonpartisan element of the CFTC's work. I receive a lot of credit for it, but people forget that it was voted through on a nonpartisan basis with the help of my Democratic colleagues at the CFTC, and it has been continued on under new Democrat leadership. And so there's no partisan or aspect to Lab CFTC. It's not a Republican thing, a Democrat thing. It is. I think it's an important part, and I think it's now an ingrained part of the CFTC's mission. In terms of other agencies, a number of agencies here in the U.S. have copied what Lab CFTC has done. It's very different than Project Innovate in the UK, which by the way was groundbreaking. We modeled a lot of Lab CFTC on Project Innovate. Project Innovate is the world leader. It brings together a unified approach at both the market regulator, the prudential regulator, and the government itself. So it's pretty remarkable in that way, and has done brilliant work. But Lab CFTC for the U.S., I think, has been a trailblazer in many ways, and I'm quite proud of it.
I think it's a fantastic achievement altogether. And of course, now we've seen the interesting scenario where over at the SEC, where you're CryptoDad, they're proclaiming Crypto Mom in the place of Hester Pierce. Actually, that was one comment that actually I have to admit, one of my junior staff was asking the other day was they were confused. Was it a case that Crypto Mom and CryptoDad? And I had to explain, no. The nature of blockchains they're entirely decentralized. These people are entirely different blockchains and not related in any way. But it's fascinating. Let's move on to actually an interesting question on the digital asset theme with Martin Watkins. Hello again, Martin. Great to see you on the show. To what extent will digital assets develop along counter-cyclical lines to reduce risk and increase market liquidity?
Well, I tell you what, I hope that choice is not made by regulators, but I hope that is sort of a market reaction to the need on the ground. I hope this is how the evolution goes in a very natural way. So to reduce risk and increase market liquidity, I think it's very possible that digital assets can do that because that's the sense of what the market needs. And so there's been some talk about stable coins and their holdings of assets, about the adequacy of transparency, about the adequacy of the holdings of instruments and their ability to stabilize cryptocurrency itself. I would hope that it's the stable coin operators and promoters themselves that address those needs, because that's what a society and its users are requesting. At some point, regulators, I think, will take a broader posture in the development of cryptocurrencies here in the U.S. But in the meantime, I hope it's the market evolution itself. That would be the right way for that increased risk resiliency and greater market liquidity to come about.
Chris, we're into the last couple of minutes. You've brought to us this evening a very pragmatic regulatorial understanding, a pro-market one, and so forth. You're sitting at the moment, you're doing some VC, you're advising Wilkie, the law firm, you're also advising various other parties, and of course you're working on this digital dollar concept. Where do you think that's going to take the world to, given the fact you just talked about how the last 30 years have seen the biggest reduction in poverty in human history, for example? So
look, all of what's happening, everything we've talked about, has to be seen within, I think, a broader context. And that is the internet. The internet was not a 20-year phenomenon. The internet is several generation long, perhaps a century long phenomenon, on a par with this, the steam age and the internal combustion age. The internet has already, the first phases of it, the first waves of it, the internet of information has changed, all the way we interact socially, the way we conduct retail sales, the way we gather information through Wikipedia and the like. The next wave of the Internet of Things, has basically changed our interaction with all types of devices and how they interact with themselves. The third wave of the internet, what Don Tapscott from Canada refers to as the Internet of Value, is another evolution of the internet that is going to change entirely the way we conduct financial services and the thing of greatest value of all, and that is money. And it's already doing it. It's been doing it now for 10 years. It's the official sector that's been slow to catch on. Society has been conducting this experiment for a long time, and it's really gathering pace. So everything that we're talking about here is in this context of the internet is once again weaving its gray magic and changing the natures of things. And John Cunliffe at the Bank of England said to me not too long ago, he said, the funny thing about money is for 100 years, it doesn't change. And then suddenly there's this enormous change in its format and the way society reacts to it. And I think we're in one of those phases now where things of value and the agencies that conduct activities with things of value, banks, asset managers, custodians, clearinghouses, are all going to be impacted by this wave. And so to answer your question, Patrick, I consider myself the luckiest person in the world right now to be active in this very exciting phase. And if I can do anything, perhaps as a senior citizen, is to kind of bring some balance to both sides of the aisle. Those that have real anger toward cryptocurrencies need to understand this is an evolutionary wave that's natural. We need to look into it and bring out its best. And those who are so enthusiastic about it that they forget the practical uses and the fiascos that will emerge if people aren't sensible about this. We've got to find the middle ground and work our way through calmly through this evolution so that we make sure that the outcome of it is greater democratization of financial services, greater financial inclusion, greater access, greater stability, greater durability of our financial market. So I think if we bring a balanced approach to that, we can achieve some great things. And it's a very exciting time to be in this space.
It's a fabulous time to be in this space. It's been a fabulous conversation, Christopher. Giancarlo, thank you, the former chairman of the CFTC. Most importantly, the conversation is going to continue. We're waiting with bated breath until September for the publication of CryptoDad and the fight for the future of money. That's going to be a fascinating tome coming out, I think, with John Wiley, if I remember correctly. And
yes,
it's going to be a super read. I am quite convinced. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a super IPO-VID with the Honourable Christopher Giancarlo, the former chairman of the CFTC. I would just like to thank, before we go, our many questioners. Martin Watkins, my apologies, we missed your second question, Martin. We just ran out of time. Mark Wheatley, Chris Messina, Beata Young, Alex Wilkinson, Jeff Cutler, Kana Kaya, thank you for being a debutant questioner on the show. Rombeat Leon Georgiadis, your debut on the show as well, thank you. Robert Finney and Robert Brown have been amongst those interacting today on IPO-VID. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of myself and our excellent speaker this evening and our production crew, thank you very much, Marianne and Veronica. I want to wish you a great week in life and markets. We're going to be away next week for a 1-week break, but I wish you all a very happy Brexit day tomorrow. Catch up with you on Exchange Invest. My name is Patrick L. Young. Have a great day.